In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steven Sasson built the first digital camera. He was 24 years old, working in Kodak's Applied Research Laboratory in Rochester, New York. The device weighed 8 pounds, captured a black and white image at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels, and took 23 seconds to record a single photograph to a cassette tape. It was not a consumer product. It was a proof of concept. It was also the invention that would eventually destroy the company that built it. Sasson presented his prototype to Kodak's management in 1976. By his own account, the reaction was not hostile. It was cautious. The questions from senior leadership were not, "Is this real?" but, "What do we do with this?" Kodak's business in 1976 was film. The company held roughly 90% of the U.S. film market. Film had an almost 50% gross margin. The business worked. The question of what to do with the technology that made film obsolete was not a comfortable question for an organization built entirely on film. Kodak did not ignore the digital camera. That's the myth, the one that makes the story fit the arrogant incumbent template. The actual history is more specific and, in a way, more troubling than the myth. Kodak studied digital photography extensively for 2 decades. The company filed hundreds of patents in digital imaging. It developed and launched consumer digital cameras in the 1990s that were, by multiple assessments, competitive products. It had a digital business unit. It had a strategy. What Kodak did not do, what it could not structurally bring itself to do, is cannibalize its film business before the market did it for them. This is the central problem in the story, and it's not a Kodak problem. It's a structural problem that shows up in every organization built around a dominant, high-margin business when a competing technology emerges that would replace it. The rational incentive at every level of the organization points in the same direction: protect the business that exists. The strategic necessity points in the opposite direction, and the organization that can't resolve that tension doesn't get destroyed by the new technology. It gets destroyed by its own inability to respond to it. That's a different kind of failure than ignorance. The financial logic of Kodak's hesitation was real. In 1996, Kodak's peak year, the company had revenues of approximately $16 billion. The film and processing business contributed the majority of that revenue at margins that a digital business, which sells hardware and software once rather than consumables continuously, structurally cannot replicate. A roll of film cost roughly 50 cents to manufacture and sold for several dollars. The customer came back every time they loaded a new roll. Digital cameras reversed that model: a significant upfront hardware cost with essentially no recurring consumable revenue. Every year that Kodak delayed the transition was a year it could book full film margins. Every year of delay was also a year that competitors Canon, Sony, Nikon were capturing the digital camera market that Kodak had patented first and entered late. The financial logic and the strategic logic ran directly against each other, and the financial logic controlled the quarterly reports that the board reviewed. This is a well-documented phenomenon in innovation economics. Clayton Christensen wrote about it in The Innovator's Dilemma, the observation that well-managed companies, following rational incentives, consistently fail to adopt disruptive technologies because the disruptive technology, in its early stages, is worse on every metric that matters to the existing customer base. Digital cameras in the early 1990s were worse than film cameras on quality, cost, and ease of use. The customers who valued those metrics stayed with film. The customers who valued convenience and immediacy started moving to digital. By the time digital quality matched film quality, the transition had already occurred, and the companies that had been protecting their film business had already lost the digital market. The question that doesn't get asked enough: what would it have taken for Kodak to make the transition? Not the philosophical question, of course, they should have moved faster. The operational question: what specific structural change would have made it possible for an organization built on film margins to invest seriously in a business that would destroy those margins? Have you ever been in an organization where the rational individual incentives pointed in the opposite direction from the strategic necessity? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how that felt from inside it. The answer, according to the research on successful technology transitions, is almost always the same: a structurally separate unit, with different incentives, different leadership, and different success metrics, insulated from the pressure to protect the existing business. Amazon built AWS as a separate business unit because Jeff Bezos understood that an internal project to disrupt Amazon's retail margins would never survive the incentive structure of the retail business. Apple launched iTunes with the explicit goal of disrupting the CD market, including the music that was sold through Apple's retail stores. Netflix launched streaming as a separate tier specifically to avoid the internal pressure from the DVD by mail business that had made the company profitable. Kodak made several attempts at this. The digital imaging division was organizationally separated at various points in the 1990s. The separations never held. The film business was too dominant, too profitable, and too organizationally central for the digital unit to develop the autonomy it needed. Every time the digital unit needed resources, it was competing with the film business that had established revenue and established relationships with the people making budget decisions. The single decision that compounded all of this was made in 1989. Kodak's board decided against making a large-scale acquisition in digital imaging, a move that would have brought in technology, talent, and organizational culture that didn't yet exist inside Kodak. The acquisition targets that were passed on in 1989 were, within a decade, acquired by Kodak's competitors. The technology and talent that Kodak declined to bring in through acquisition, it later had to develop internally at far greater cost, far later in the competitive cycle, and without the organizational DNA that came with the acquired companies. One decision passed over in a board meeting in 1989. The consequences were visible within 5 years and catastrophic within 15. If this level of historical specificity, not the myth version of the story, but the mechanism, is what makes this worth your time. The like is the direct feedback signal that makes more of this viable. The question is always the same. What was the specific decision point where the outcome became significantly harder to change? And who was in the room when it was made? Steven Sasson was awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation in 2009 by President Obama. It was a recognition of the digital camera he had built 34 years earlier. By 2009, Kodak stock had declined more than 90% from its peak. The company would file for bankruptcy 3 years later. Sasson has given interviews over the years that are unusually candid for someone who spent his career inside an organization. He describes presenting the digital camera prototype to management in 1976 and being told, explicitly, that it was a cute project, but that they would never want to tell anyone about it because film was the business. He describes subsequent years of watching the technology he had built be studied, patented, improved, and not deployed at the scale it required, for reasons he understood but found frustrating. He is not bitter. He has said in interviews that he understands the business logic. He makes no claim that the people who made those decisions were wrong, given the information and incentives they had in front of them. What he describes is something more specific and harder to categorize: the experience of watching an organization be perfectly rational in its short-term calculations and systematically wrong in its aggregate trajectory, of understanding exactly why each individual decision made sense, and watching the accumulated logic of those sensible decisions lead somewhere that nobody intended. The 145,000 people who worked for Kodak at its peak employment did not understand this dynamic from inside it. They worked for a company that was, by conventional metrics, one of the strongest businesses in the world for most of the time they were there. The collapse, when it came, looked sudden from outside. From inside, it looked like what happens when you follow rational incentives for 20 years in a world that has already decided to move in a different direction. That's the version of this story that doesn't fit the arrogant incumbent template, and it's considerably harder to build a defense against. The Kodak story is taught as a failure of vision. That framing is wrong in a specific and important way. Kodak had vision. The company's research division saw the digital transition coming with more clarity and more lead time than almost any other incumbent in any comparable disruption. The patents, the internal studies, the competitive analyses, the documentation of what was coming is extensive, and it predates by years the moment when the market became impossible to ignore. What Kodak lacked was not vision. It was the organizational structure that would have allowed the vision to override the incentive. Every individual in the organization, from the engineers in the lab to the executives on the board, was operating rationally within the system they were inside. The system was optimized for film. The system produced decisions that were optimal for film. The aggregate output of 100 rational, well-intentioned decisions was a trajectory that led the company directly into the disruption it had seen coming for decades. The practical thing: if you're in an organization with a strong existing business and an emerging technology that could threaten it, the question to ask is not, does leadership understand the threat? They almost certainly do. The question is, what is the incentive structure at every level of the organization when someone in the new business unit has to compete for resources with someone in the existing business unit? If the answer is that the existing business unit wins by default, because it has revenue, because it has relationships, because it has the established processes and the established metrics, then the vision doesn't matter. The system will reproduce the behavior that protects the existing business until the existing business is gone. The next episode in this series looks at an organization that solved this problem not by having better vision, but by building a structure that made the incentive of the new business incompatible with the incentive of the existing one. The outcome was not what the standard narrative of disruption predicts. That's why it's worth examining. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.